It's a privilege to introduce Mustafa Akyol and Dalia Mogahed to you. Mustafa is a senior fellow at Cato, runs their Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity program, focused on public policy, Islam and modernity. He's been a frequent New York Times opinion writer since 2013, has 4 books out, sort of a big hedgehog theme, if you will, is sort of reopening Muslim minds, the newest one, which a few of you I know have read, some of you currently are reading, Why I as a Muslim Defend Liberty, 21, The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet to the Muslims, a prophet of the Muslims, Islam Without Extremes, Muslim Case for Liberty. There's a podcast called The Thinking Muslim that calls Mustafa perhaps the most notable Muslim modernist and reformer. Mustafa will start us off with some thoughts connected to this book and ways that Islam and pluralism also connect in the United States. Then we'll hear from Dalia Mogahed, who runs the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which has a space in DC and a space in Dearborn, Michigan. She's born in Cairo, immigrated to the country at age 4, as an author, advisor, and consultant, has her own practice. She ran the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, which surveys Muslim opinion and really skewers some of the myths and stereotypes around Muslim attitudes toward politics. She's done a lot, especially after 9/11, a wonderful TED Talk, if you haven't seen, that has been very broadly viewed. She wrote a book with John Esposito called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, based on 6 years of research and more than 50,000 interviews representing Muslims in 35 predominantly Muslim countries. She served on Obama's faith-based office, and opens up a lot of things about the country that a lot of people misconstrue. So Mustafa, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josh. Good morning, and thanks for having me here. Just one tiny detail. I don't run the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity at Cato. I work there, just for the record.
I'm very prone to exaggeration.
It's beyond me, right, to run it, but I work there on the idea of liberty and Islamic thought in the Muslim world. So just a clarification, but thank you so much. That was a wonderful, gracious introduction. In the beginning of my book, Reopening Muslim Minds, I tell a personal story, so I want to begin with that, which helped me elucidate some theoretical issues that we can discuss today. In 2017, I was a newcomer to the US, and I got an invitation to go and speak at Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. It's exactly the other end of the planet. I said, okay, I'll do it. It takes a day to go there. But this was my 5th trip to Malaysia because I've been there before. There's a particular organization there called Islamic Renaissance Front. They want to spread ideas of human rights and freedom with an Islamic argumentation for it. They're pious Muslims, who believe in liberty. And they had invited me there before. This time they said, Mustafa, your book is translated. So they had translated my book recently. It's a book launch. There'll be a lot of events, a lot of people waiting for you. Come here, and you'll have great fun. I said, okay. So I went there. The first event was great, but the second event was on a sensitive topic. It's the topic of apostasy. You're familiar with it. Publicly renouncing your religion and accepting another religion. And in a free society, we don't want fellow believers to lose their faith. We may feel for their salvation, but we don't consider this as a crime. But in about a dozen Muslim majority countries today, and there are 50 Muslim majority countries, so don't think that all of them have the same things. They're very diverse, very different. But in a dozen of them, Saudi Arabia, Iran for sure, Yemen, Mauritania, Afghanistan, especially now, apostasy is a crime punishable by death. It's rarely implemented, but it's in the law, and there's been cases of people executed for apostasy or jailed for a long time. And sometimes fellow Muslims have been blamed for apostasy, although they're true believers, and that's actually used more to kind of put a pressure on their views. Now, Malaysians are proudly moderate, so they don't do execution for apostasy. It's not that harsh. But in some parts of Malaysia, they send you to a rehabilitation center to fix you in the next 6 months to come back to Islam and to re-educate you. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic, so I gave this 30-minute lecture, and I said, look, I'm not I'm not an imam, I don't claim any religious authority, but I've been following all these discussions in Islam, and there are sheikhs and imams who actually says, as we can reinterpret this issue, this ban on apostasy has no basis in the Quran, period. just like apostasy laws. It comes from some post-Quranic texts and their medieval interpretations. But at the time, apostasy was something Christians criminalized as well. At the time, it implied treason to the state as well, because when you become an apostate, you'll probably join the enemy army, and we are in constant war. It was the context to it, which we don't have anymore. And third, I said, well, if people don't believe in Islam, by the way, you cannot make them believers again by forcing them, by threatening them. Faith is not something you can dictate. Faith is not something you can police. So that was a punchline. People loved it. The audience loved it. And it was a place like this. People were leaving. And then some 5 serious men walked into the room, and they walked to me and they said, "Are you Mustafa Akgül?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Did you say religion cannot be policed?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Good. We are the religion police." So they said, "We heard complaints about your talk, so we have to ask you questions." They took me to a side. They took photos. They took a photo of me, like behind the wall. I said, "Something's going on." Anyway, then they said, "We will watch your video and let you know about the next steps." And I didn't think the next steps would be a big deal. I went to my hotel that night. I slept, but I woke up Kuala Lumpur, and I heard that I was summoned to the religious police headquarters to give my testimony to a judge, to a prosecutor. And my host, Islamic Renaissance France guys, they said, "Mustafa, just don't go there. Buy souvenirs for your wife," which I was always planning to do. And we'll deal with lawyers. Go there, and tonight it won't be a problem. I said, "Okay." So I went to Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 8 p.m. I got my boarding pass. I came to the passport check, and the female officer who typed my name, she saw my name and she panicked, and then she called some people, and they called some people. I was detained at the airport because apparently the religious police had issued a nationwide arrest order to get me. And I was put in the religious police headquarters that night in a cell. Next morning, I was taken to a court. And I was questioned for 2 hours. And a few times they asked me if I really quoted the Quranic verse, Baqarah 256, which probably every Muslim knows, which begins by saying, La ikraha fid din, or there is no compulsion in religion. There's a verse like that in the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion because truth has become manifest from error, it goes on to say. But the beginning of that has become the motto of liberal-minded Muslims in the past century. There's no compulsion in religion, so we have religious freedom in Islam. So they said, "Did you quote the verse?" I said, "Yeah. Why wouldn't I not quote the verse?" So they wrote that he quoted like Rafiddin. And at the end, they said, "Okay, we will release you." I said, "Thank you. That's the best thing I heard since last night." But they said, "Don't come back to Malaysia and teach Islam again." I said, "You can be sure about that." And then I got on the plane that I missed the other night. So I went out of Malaysia without any trouble. But I was thinking, why were they obsessed with me quoting La ikraha fid din? No, there's no compulsion in religion. Then I said, let me check how they translate it. Because I had seen some translations published in Saudi Arabia which don't put it like that, which add a few words in parentheses into the text to explain it. And I checked the website of JAKIM, that's the religious ministry of Malaysia, and I saw that, they're doing what the Saudis are doing. So there is no compulsion in religion, that's the phrase. Instead writes, there is no compulsion in entering the religion. They just didn't put the parentheses, they put entering the religion. So, but what is the difference between there is no compulsion in religion versus there is no compulsion in only entering the religion? Well, the implication is you can enter, but you cannot exit. Right? Like Hotel California, as Malaysian liberals are saying. And this is not in the Quranic text. It's in the medieval jurisprudence. They take it as normative. So the Quran says this, it doesn't sound exactly, it sounds too liberal, so we have to do something about it. So they put that into the explanation. Then I wrote an article about this and so on and so forth, I explained. And of course, we know that actually, they rely on tradition, they're not coming out of nowhere. In classical Islam, the phrase, there is no compulsion in religion, and some other texts in the Quran, some other verses, were luckily accepted by Muslims for some important level of religious freedom. I mean, in classical Islam, Jews and Christians were not forcibly converted into Islam, which was a very liberal thing at the time. So actually that verse was functional, very, very important in Islamic history. But they also believed that we will not forcibly convert you, but once you're in it, you can't exit because apostasy is banned based on a narration that is reported from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It comes from just one narrator, not a multiple narrator, so its authenticity can be actually discussed. I mean, there are endless discussions about this topic, but they believe apostasy is banned, so we have to do this. Not just that apostasy is banned, also, they believe that once you're in the religion, your religiosity can be policed. Right? I mean, that's the main function of the religious police. Like in Malaysia is very mild on this. But if a Muslim drinks publicly, Chinese can, so there are a lot of bars in Kuala Lumpur. But if a Muslim is not supposed to, and if he does, the police will come and admonish him, and so on and so forth. In Saudi Arabia, it could be worse. In Iran, it could be certainly worse. Iran has a religious police, as we all know, so it tells Muslim women to wear the hijab, the headscarf. Just like in France, they tell women to take it off. Iran tells them to put it on. None of them accept that women have the right to, choose their way of life and their way of practice. So the idea of religious policing is also a key issue here, monitoring that the Muslims are properly behaving and they are in their religion. Now, I begin my book with the story, and I say this story is just a example of a bigger thing we're discussing in Islam today. And that is the problem of religious illiberalism, as I call it, religious coercion. And this problem is there in the world of Islam today. Not everywhere. Bosnia, where my wife is from, is one of the most liberal Muslim societies, have freedom levels as like European countries. Like Spain, as I documented at Cato Institute's report. But if you go to the end of the spectrum, in 12 countries, you have apostasy laws. In 24 countries, you have blasphemy laws. So blaspheming against the Prophet, the Quran, or Islamic values are an offense. Not that I want to see that offense as a Muslim, I don't. But should we criminalize that is a different question. And blasphemy laws, we know, leads to a lot of human rights violations, especially in Pakistan, where almost every month, somebody gets jailed or lynched on the streets by militant groups for often on false charges of blasphemy. There are laws that give women less rights than men and give non-Muslims less rights than Muslims. So this problem is there. It is not even too marginal. And this is different from, I should say, the problem of terrorism, which attracted a lot of attention since 9/11, as we all know. Terrorism is incredibly marginal in the world of Islam. People who would sympathize with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, there's a very, very, very small minority, and actually they hate other Muslims more than anybody else. So that is really a problem of extremism. But when it comes to religious illiberalism, it has a bigger ground. And that's where I think it needs an honest discussion. Now, people actually discuss this issue. And some people say, oh, yeah, there's a solution. What is the solution? All Muslim societies need an Ataturk or an Iranian Shah, I mean, these are kind of early 20th century autocratic rulers which came and crushed Islamic institutions, banned the headscarf or the fez, in the Turkish case, tried to secularize the society by force. They did what the French love to do, forcibly unveil Muslim, the French secularists, not all French, there are true liberals in France too, but the French secularists can be hard. I'm not speaking about that. That was the wrong, solution to what we're speaking about. That was wrong in itself because it was authoritarian in itself and lead to a lot of human rights violations. Second, it only is counterproductive and creates a backlash. If you have not been following Iran and Turkey in the past 10, 40 years, you see a comeback of the religious conservatives in Iran in a much harsher and militant way, Turkey more mild, democratic, but still in a kind of revengeful way, which has some grim consequences. This is also not about some narcissistic crown prince coming in, giving some social freedoms while butchering his critical journalists who criticize him. So no, that's not where, that is again authoritarian in itself, and it will have wrong consequences. The solution is something like, and because before speaking on a solution, we should think that, is Islam the only religion who has this problem? Did Catholics ever do something against blasphemers or apostates, like heretics? Did people get burned in the stakes? Yeah, I mean, there's a whole history of Christian religious coercion and illiberalism that define much of Christian history, actually. Actually, for a long time, Islam was a more liberal religion compared to Christianity at the time. That's what Jews know this better than everybody else, because when they were persecuted in Europe, especially in Spain, for example, they were given to choose options to convert to Christianity or to die or to migrate, and they migrated to the lens of Islam repeatedly. So until the 18th century, actually, Islam was more pluralistic because we gave Jews and Christians the right to practice their religion. In Christian Europe, there was more persecution, there was more interfaith violence, sectarian violence, and so on and so forth. Now, Christianity changed, and it changed thanks to the historical process we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment had an anti-religious and actually militant strain that I don't like, and I don't think that's not a solution. Actually, unfortunately, Muslims have always looked up to that as an example. But the Enlightenment had figures like John Locke or Moses Mendelssohn in the Jewish tradition. Enlightenment ideas, also Roger Williams in the United States, the ideas of religious freedom. They did not oppose their religious tradition. They reinterpreted with a perspective of human freedom and human toleration. So that's why I say sometimes we are at a John Locke moment in Islam. And I emphasize John Locke a lot because when I read his first book, his great book, first time, A Letter Concerning Toleration, I said, oh my God, he's speaking about our problems. He says that religion cannot be coerced, and when you make people, try to make people bring to the same faith, to the true faith, people will not become true believers, but hypocrites. He says, religious coercion will lead to the contempt of his divine majesty, which is happening in Iran today. When you impose religion, it doesn't bring love for the religion, but it brings contempt to it. And that's why some people are burning their hijabs in Iran and becoming actually anti-religious because they despise the Iranian regime. So that is the kind of transformation. And how this looks like, whoa, apostasy laws. Let's discuss this for 5 days, right? Let's discuss blasphemy laws. Does Prophet Muhammad really say this? Or if he said that, was there a context to it was that person in that war particularly targeted because he was a blasphemer or he had attacked Muslims in the first place? Like there are endless theoretical discussions on these issues, which I discuss in my book. But these will go on, and I think you may think that the world of Islam is today so in some parts illiberal, it's never going to change. Sometimes the most illiberal time is when you begin to change because you see the consequences of that. That was what happened with actually the Lockean revolution. John Locke came after religious conflict and sectarianism within Christianity. So this is the world of Islam, and we can expand that. Well, but what is America? Our panel is about American Muslims. American Muslims, or Muslims in the West, are having an experience that is actually kind of new in the Islamic civilization. An experience of living not under Islamic rule, but living under the rule of non-Muslims, which was not the case for many long centuries for most Muslims. From the very beginning, Muslims had their states. They spread as an empire. They tolerated other people, not with equal rights, so it's not a liberal toleration, but it was, for its time, it was important. And Muslims lived under the Ottoman Empire. They lived under Caliph. They lived under Sultan. They lived under the guidance of the Sharia, Islamic law, and they could practice their religion. In the modern era, Muslims began to have a new experience, which they never had before. Oh, we are living under non-Muslims this time. And it began with Bosnia when Austria-Hungarian Empire took Bosnia-Herzegovina from the Ottomans. Austria-Hungarians, in Berlin Congress in 1878. And Bosnians found themselves under Austro-Hungarian rule and what to do with now. And actually Austro-Hungarians were liberal enough to give them a religious space, so they established an institution called Riyaset, which is a kind of established a civil Islam. And Bosnia, which is still very vibrant and also very admirably tolerant and liberal leaning. Muslims in India are having a different experience. We can speak about that. That's kind of growingly getting grim. But Muslims in America and Europe also are now living in societies, and they came willingly in most cases, with the exception of people who have origins in slavery, obviously. But they are living here. So the question is this going to be a successful experiment? Like, will you thrive in non-Muslim societies? Do you need to live under the Sharia? Or can you be happy in liberalism and be a good Muslim and thrive and be an example and maybe even question some of the things back in your world? So this is the experiment that is actually, in my view, happening in American Islam, especially in America, because in Europe, because of a lot of complicated reasons in Europe, sometimes Muslim communities, at least elements among them, sometimes tend to close themselves from the broader society. That is especially true in France, in part because the broader society is not very welcoming and very open-minded. But in America, Muslims have been, Dalia will tell much more about that, have been very well integrated. In America, there are all kinds of Muslims, from hardcore Salafis to Shiites, to Ahmadis, which are normally persecuted in Pakistan. And they're all happily living under the Constitution, civil liberties. It's my country, my freedom, nobody. And some experience is evolving. Now, there's a historical analogy to that. Catholicism also was not a very liberal religion for a very long time. I mean, killing the apostates was maybe medieval. But until mid-20th century, religious freedom was not fully appreciated by the Catholic Church. I mean, in the 19th century, popes were speaking of that error has no right, and this idea of secularization and secular state is not an acceptable thing. Things changed dramatically in Catholicism in the mid-20th century, ultimately leading to Vatican II, where Catholic Church took a very decidedly classical liberal position on religious freedom, freedom of conscience, even discussing, is there salvation outside of the, church, which is a discussion for us too. Is there salvation outside of the mosque? Which I believe there is, but that's a different discussion. And historians, and I learned from Catholic historians, I don't know this issue very well, but Daniel Philpott has a very good book on this, comparing Catholic development of doctrine towards liberalism and discussions in Islam today. He's a professor at Notre Dame. Historians point to an interesting feedback. In the liberalization of Catholic doctrine, American Catholics played an important role. Because here, they realize this freedom thing is good. It's good for us. Thanks to this, we can have our churches and institutions, and the government doesn't go after us because we are heretical Christians, from the Protestant point of view. So the feedback from the American Catholic experience had a positive impact on the mainstream Catholic thought, and it was one of the inputs that all the way went to Vatican II. I believe something like this is beginning to happen in the West today. I see some American Muslims saying that this is a great country, we have our freedom, we can have mosques, churches, we wear whatever we want, nobody says anything to us. But also they're a little bit concerned about a problem which might threaten this experience, but they also know that there are forces in our country that don't want us, that want to, attack us, that demonize us, that show us them as, aliens and so on and so forth. The problem with Islamophobia. That's why it's very important not to derail the Western liberal Muslim experience by forces of Islamophobia. Because if that happens, the argument of the hardcore Islamists will be proven. And you know what that argument is? That argument is these non-Muslims, they will never accept you. They're always looking for reasons to persecute you. Unless you convert to their religion, they will be never happy with you. So you think they're tolerating you in the West? They're actually, getting ready to persecute you in different ways, and something is worse to come. So let's make sure that that argument doesn't win, and the Muslim experience in the West goes successfully, so that Muslims in Pakistan or your relatives in Pakistan or Iran or Afghanistan can see that to be a good Muslim, you don't need to have an Islamic order that's going to punish what is un-Islamic. You just need a liberal order where you can proudly and safely practice your faith and manifest it. So that brings to the really important discussion we'll have today, which is Dahlia's. And so I'll stop it there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Good morning. Peace be upon you. I think I want to start with the fact that I'm here because of a great American president that we're about to lose. So President Carter, as a part of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, many people don't know this, but a part of that peace treaty were scholarships for Egyptian students to come to the United States to study. And one of those students was my mother, who got a scholarship to pursue her PhD in civil engineering. And my father followed her, got his own funding. He didn't get a scholarship. And so that is how I came to the United States and ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was 5 years old. I grew up in Madison, or sometimes it's called the People's Republic of Madison. So if you're not familiar, it's a college town, very, very progressive, sometimes called the Berkeley of the Midwest. And as I grew up, attending public school and living in a very international environment, because everyone that went to my school had either parents who were grad students or professors, I was really concerned as a young person with the question of social justice. I cared a great deal about fairness and a just society, and what did that look like, and how did it happen? And I became very, very interested as a teenager in the American Civil Rights Movement, which I thought I had no real direct connection to. But I read about it, I learned about it in school, and one day, when I was 15 years old, I stumbled on a book in my library, to my amazement and shock and awe, about a Muslim civil rights leader named Malcolm X. And I had no idea, as a young person, that Muslims had any part to play in the civil rights movement until I read this book, this autobiography, which I read, in like 3 days, and it completely changed my outlook on my faith, on my role in America, and on my future. So the reading of Malcolm X led me to reading the Quran. And up until then, I was a good Egyptian daughter who followed the rules, but Islam was something that I was inheriting. I didn't reject it by any means, but it wasn't a deliberate decision until I was led to my holy scripture by an American civil rights leader. So upon reading the Quran, really wrestling with it as a teenager, it won the wrestling match. And I guess I converted to Islam at that time, as a true believer, as a deliberate decision, rather than someone who's just inheriting it. And it was at the age of 17, as a part of that spiritual journey, that I decided to wear hijab, which is my head covering, and started college as a visibly Muslim woman, also in the College of Engineering. I did mention I was Egyptian, which also means I'm an engineer. That's just how it works. So it's a little bit of a redundancy. So I was a college activist in addition to an engineer, and I worked on things like the Bosnia genocide, which is when I was in college. And I also wrote for my college newspaper about issues of Islamophobia, although there was really no word that I knew for it at the time. And upon graduation, I started a job in corporate America and retreated from this kind of activism. I got married, I had my first son, his name is Tariq, and I was just sort of living the American Egyptian dream. And one day we were going to be driving across Middle America to start grad school, my husband and I at the time. And we had packed our bags up in a car, and my son was 3 months old. And we were having breakfast, watching the news, and to our horror, planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York. And it was, of course, September 11th, 2001. So I cannot really recount the emotions of that morning, except to say that I've never felt that way before. It was horror, anger, and confusion. And so we didn't know what was happening, what was going to happen, what anyone was thinking. So we postponed our drive to Pittsburgh from Cincinnati till the next day. And then when we were driving across Ohio and into Pennsylvania, we waited as long as we could to get gas because we were literally afraid. We just didn't know what people were feeling or thinking that the next day after that attack. And I remember the first time in my life that I was afraid for people to know I was a Muslim. And when we stopped for gas after we had no choice in the middle of nowhere, for my own safety, I felt I sunk down into the car so that no one could look into the window and see me. And we finally got, to where we were going and got to our apartment in Pittsburgh. And it truly felt not only like we were in a new town, but a whole new world, like everything had changed overnight. And that was a Wednesday. And so that Friday is, of course, the day that Muslims gather for congregational prayer. And there were warnings that were being issued by different organizations that it might be a target, and people were actually being encouraged not to go to the mosque that day. And this wasn't paranoia. I have personal contacts with people who their Islamic school had bomb threats, and people were being beaten up in the street and so forth. So this wasn't, there were actual arson attacks on mosques during that week. This wasn't just paranoia. There was some concern, and some of it was justified. So I really had a choice to make. Me and my family, my infant, should we go to the mosque that Friday or not? And it was a brand new city. We didn't know anybody. We just didn't know what the relationship was between the community and sort of their neighbors and so forth. And so we decided initially not to go to the mosque. We thought, why not just be safe? It's just better to stay home. And then as I sort of thought about it, I thought, these people attacked our country. They attacked our country. And I'm not going to allow them to dictate how I practice my faith in my own country. So we decided to go to the mosque that day. And, it was a tense car ride, and I put my son in the car seat, and mostly just not knowing what to expect. A protest, angry neighbors, who knows? So we got there, we parked the car, and the parking lot was completely full, to my surprise. And I took my son out, I was carrying him, I took my shoes off, went in, and what I saw completely took me aback. It was one of those moments where, it took my breath away. And it was that a full half of the congregation that day weren't neighbors that came to express anger, but rather solidarity. A full half of the congregation were people of other faiths and no faiths who had come to, in really courageously and compassionately, to say, you are safe here and you are accepted. And it completely changed my feeling and my outlook about this new city and this new America that we were now living in. And it was really at this moment, if I trace it back, that I rededicated myself to being a bridge builder and an educator. And that is what I'm here to do as the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, before that at Gallup. My work and my life's mission is as an educator and a bridge builder. And so today's main discussion is, what are some of the obstacles to realizing some of the things that Mustafa talked about in terms of the American Muslim context being a space, an intellectual space for these important discussions. I want to talk to you about Islamophobia as it exists today in the United States. And my thesis is that I don't want you to worry about Islamophobia because it impacts me. I want you to worry about Islamophobia because it impacts you. My thesis is that Islamophobia is a threat to every single American, not just the 1% who identify as Muslim. We're only 1%, by the way. And that is because it makes everyone less free and less safe. And so first I want to make the case that it exists, in case that is not apparent. If you're not experiencing it every day, I understand. I get it. You may not realize what it is and how it manifests. The second thing is I want to make the case why it makes everyone less safe and less free, and then I will end with some recommendations for what we can do about it. So what are the manifestations, or how do I make the case that it exists? Well, first, we just, very simple, is Pew just came out with a report about American perceptions of different religious communities. Which ones are the most warmly regarded? Which ones are the least warmly regarded? Well, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the report, Muslims are the least warmly regarded major religious group in America. The good news, and I was actually happy about this, is that the plurality just have no opinion, which is great. I'm like, let's go with that. Let's go with no opinion. But it is, the net is negative. And they are the least warmly regarded of any faith community. And that is hardly surprising. And we at ISPU have been doing scientific surveys of American Muslims, American Jews, American Catholics, American Protestants, and non-affiliated Americans for the past 7 years. And what we found year after year after year is that a majority of American Muslims, the most likely faith community in America, says that they have faced some frequency of what they believe to be discrimination for their faith. And it's roughly 60% year after year. Doesn't matter if Obama's in the White House or Trump or Biden. It's just the stable numbers. Around roughly 60% have experienced or report experiencing some frequency of religious-based discrimination. The Jewish community, it's around 52%, and it has been rising. Muslims are around 60% most likely to report that, but it's very stable across the board. Now, the manifestation of that discrimination is what makes Muslims unique and different from other minority faith communities in America. And that is that it is not only interpersonal, from a coworker or interacting, with people at the grocery store. I think every Muslim has some story to tell you about some microaggression or something being screamed out at them or whatever. But it's that it's institutional. That's what makes it different. Other religious minorities in America, their experience of religious discrimination, according to the research, is much more interpersonal. Where Muslims are different is that we're also experiencing on the institutional level things like banking while Muslim, your bank account gets closed, or your business bank account gets closed, or something gets flagged. Twice as likely to experience issues while banking, while interacting with law enforcement, traveling while Muslim, applying for a job, so experiencing discrimination while applying for a job. And the list goes on, and even things like in the judicial system around sentencing, and this is very well documented. 4 times the sentence for very similar plots, not things that have been executed, but ideologically motivated plots. So you have a Muslim defendant and a non-Muslim defendant, both planning plots to do terrible things, very similar in nature, and the Muslim will get literally 4 times the sentence for very similar crimes. So that's how it impacts adults. It's also impacted, it doesn't discriminate, by age though. There's also, unfortunately, children, and bullying is a huge problem. So roughly half of Muslim families who have children in school report having their children having been bullied at some frequency in the past year for their faith. Again, the most likely faith community to be targeted for bullying. But what's really upsetting, I think, for me about the bullying question is the source of the bullying, a third of the time, is an adult, not another student, a teacher or an administrator. So if that's kind of the manifestation of Islamophobia, what causes it? What is the cause of Islamophobia? And the easy answer, and the answer that I've always subscribed to, is 9/11 is the cause of Islamophobia. Duh. But the data makes that much more complicated. And here's why. Pew has been tracking a sentiment among Americans for the past 22 years, even before 9/11. And something really strange about that is when it spikes and when it doesn't. So the sentiment, there's two different questions that they've asked, and I'll start with the second one. The second one is they've asked the American public whether or not they believe that Islam encourages violence more than other religions. So this question was asked first of the American public in November of 2001, right after the attacks of 9/11. And it's been asked throughout the past 2 decades. Now, if you think about it, this question about Islam encouraging violence more than other religions, one would expect, and understandably so, that it would be very high right after a horrific terrorist attack, and then become, as people sort of gain perspective, learn more, go down slowly over time. But in fact, the opposite is the case, where in 2001, November of 2001, a third of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats said that they believed Islam encourages violence more than other religions. And that is among Republicans, the lowest it'll ever be. Do you know what it is today? Or at least in 2017, that's the latest. It is double that, 67%, with no new terrorist attacks. And when does it spike? It went up in the run-up to the Iraq War, a war that yesterday was the 20th anniversary. And that was among Republicans and Democrats. And then it spikes among Republicans, specifically around election cycles. So the Boston bombing, another terrible tragedy and outrage, did not change that number among Republicans at all. No correlation with an actual terrorist attack even 9/11. But the 2012 election cycle had that number go up by 12 points among Republicans. Now, what does that tell me as an analyst? That it's Islamophobic, endorsing Islamophobic tropes is not the understandable response to bad Muslims doing bad things. It is not organic. It is a tool, Islamophobia is a tool of public manipulation. It follows political rhetoric. So right after 9/11, George W. Bush came out and said, this was not Islam. And I will forever be grateful for that. And people heard him. And so only a third of Republicans had, endorsed this trope. But when it became necessary to drum up support for the Iraq War, that number actually started going up, not down. And there was a spike in that perception around 2003. In 2003. It started to then go down and started spiking among just Republicans around election cycles. So we are being, this sentiment is being manufactured for very specific political motives. The other thing to keep in mind, so if it's not sort of explained simply by 9/11, what does explain it? There's a number of things. The first thing that I encourage you to read more about is the Islamophobia industry. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not something that is imagined. This is a documented phenomena. This is a documented group of individuals and institutions with access to millions of dollars whose entire mission it is to churn out fear of Islam and Muslims. I encourage you to read a report called Fear Inc. and Fear Inc. 2.0 that documents this industry. The Center for American Progress issued both of those reports. There's also the issue of the media, and it's always very sensitive to talk to a group of journalists about the media. But it's important to keep these, to make these things real and to have an honest conversation about it. So this is according to media content analysis. So in 2015, an organization called Media Tenor that does media content analysis of all kinds, mostly for corporate clients, did a study, and they've been doing this for a while, and they found that 90% of coverage of Islam and Muslims in US news media was negative. And this was specifically TV news media. That same year, they looked at coverage of North Korea, and it was 70% negative. So you have this global religious community, of which most are allies of the United States, more negatively portrayed than a country that was literally threatening to nuke California that year. And the global Muslim community is more negatively portrayed. Again, Media Tenor is out of Germany. No dog in this fight, just doing this study. And just in case we only blame TV news media, because that's what it was, another study out of 416 labs found that the New York Times portrayed Islam more negatively than cancer and cocaine over the past 25 years. So it's not when I say media, these things are documented. We can talk about Hollywood as another sort of aspect of that. But there are reasons why Islamophobia is what it is. What are the direct impacts of Islamophobia? Why should anyone care who isn't being directly, or so they think, is not being directly impacted? So some of the more obvious ones, as I've already kind of laid out, is it does impact Muslims. And as moral human beings, we should care about our fellow, human beings if they're being unjustly treated. So it makes us less safe. I'll start with the obvious. Muslims are less safe, right? If you look at things like what happened in New Zealand, this was 4 years ago on March 15th, I don't want to call him crazed, he was sane, fully sane human, went in and killed 50 people while they prayed. But those are such extreme events. They still happen. It does make Muslims more less safe, and hate crimes were at their height in 2016, even more than after 9/11. But then there are these institutional manifestations, which I also explained. Now, how does it make other Americans less safe? Well, here's just one example. There was an actual recruiting video during the 2016 election cycle by Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization, where they were bringing clips from the Republican primary debates in their recruiting video to recruit terrorists to kill us by using our anti-Muslim rhetoric to recruit. So to think that anti-Muslim rhetoric is being tough on being tough when it comes to national security and keeping America safe by calling it what it is insane, is completely untrue. It is actually the very fodder that, it's like these two sides are feeding off of each other. The actual deviants, I don't even call them extremists, because being extremely Muslim means you're very charitable and very compassionate. You're a deviant. You've gone off the reservation. You're not, if the Quran is a recipe book and it says 1 teaspoon of sugar, it's not, an extremist puts a cup of sugar. A deviant person, which is what I think these people are, put a cup of cyanide. They've got it completely wrong, right? So if they're using anti-Muslim rhetoric in our political landscape to recruit people, to enrage people, to alienate people even further, then that's not keeping us safe. Islamophobia is very unsafe. But it also makes us less free. And here's a couple reasons why. So at ISPU, we've created something called the Islamophobia Index. And what that is simply a measure of the level of endorsement the public has for specific anti-Muslim tropes. So there are 5 of them that other researchers have found correlate with acceptance of policies that are anti-democratic. And what you find is as this number goes up, a few things happen, and all else being equal, so this is like a linear regression. When people endorse these 5 tropes, they're also more likely to do a few things. One is endorse anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, endorse anti-democratic policies like suspending checks and balances and freedom of the press in the wake of a terrorist attack, so it's bad for democracy, and endorse or sympathize or sometimes think is okay political violence. So Islamophobia is correlated with anti-democratic views, racism and anti-Semitism, as well as political violence or endorsement or sympathy with political violence. So it makes us less safe and less free for those reasons. But ultimately, it's fueled by fear. And according to neuroscience research, fear makes us more likely to succumb or to endorse authoritarianism, prejudice, and give up our own rights. Fear kills freedom. So if Islamophobia is bad for everyone, what should we do about it? Well, we have people in this room that have a great deal that they can do and have incredible impact on how people see the world, right? The first draft of history, informing people to enable democracy. So what can media professionals do? And we have an entire toolkit on our website that you can have for free at ispu.org/journalists. And I think some of you have gotten an email with some links as well from my colleague at ISPU, Catherine Copeland. So the first thing is to recognize what are the narratives that underpin Islamophobia and to become aware of them. And to understand to actually question them. Are they accurate or not? And then to become much more critical in the way that we consume news and write it. So one of the questions to ask is, what's religion got to do with it? If this exact same story was being written about a Christian or someone from sort of the dominant culture, would we rush to explain their behavior with their religion? Would we be asking the same questions? Is a Muslim capable of being mentally ill? Yes. Could they have something in their childhood that made them act that way? Absolutely. Religion is not the only explanation for Muslim behavior, especially when it's bad behavior, right? So to become much more critical with, is this really explained by faith? A second, broad piece of recommendation is around how we cover Muslim women. Muslim women are by far, even more than men, believe it or not, the most stereotyped group when it comes to covering American Muslims or Muslims in general. Again, this question of, can we explain whatever we're doing according to the state of the human race rather than Muslims? So for example, we do research on Muslim communities as well as other faith communities, and one of the questions we ask is around domestic violence. Domestic violence is a human problem. It is actually as prevalent in Muslim communities as it is in Catholic communities, as it is in non-affiliated communities. This is a human problem. So if we're writing a story about domestic violence in a Muslim family, how do we write it as a manifestation of the human condition rather than an essentialized Muslim problem? And these things are incredibly important because it helps to reverse this idea of otherization. And then finally, the third thing, and there are many other recommendations in our toolkit, but the third thing is to really be very critical with the idea of otherizing Muslims in the way that we speak about them. There's never been an America without Islam. There's never been an America without Islam. There were Muslims who were fighting in the Revolutionary War. This is a real thing. So to position or to frame Islam or Muslims as a foreign religion, which is everything we heard about yesterday when it comes to white Christian nationalism, is inaccurate. It's an actual historical inaccuracy. Islam is as American as any other faith in our country. And so this idea, Islam hates us. No, Islam doesn't hate us. Islam is us. And so a real questioning of the otherization of Muslims in Islam. And I'll stop here. I look forward to your questions.
That's great. All right, over to you. Maybe we start with Philip Yancey.
I heard this statement from a Muslim layman who is fairly well educated, and he said this. He said, I've read every word of the Christian Bible, especially the New Testament, and I can't find any advice on how to live as a majority in a country. I've read every word of the Quran, and I can't find any advice on how to live as a minority in a country. And I'm interested in your reaction. My first response when I heard that was, well, that makes sense. Christianity, as I understand it from the New Testament, is a counterforce. It's what Martin Luther King called the conscience of the state, not the master or the servant. But the little I knew about Islamic countries was that there was a desire to be holistic, so that the government, the legal structure, the moral code, etc., were one in a different way. So I'd love to hear your response to his formulation.
Thank you. Very interesting question. I would encourage also read the Old Testament to get a full picture. I think there is a difference in the foundational stories of Islamic Christianity, politically speaking, and that is the fact that Jesus Christ was a preacher, but he never led armies. He didn't establish a polity that you can call a state. He didn't fight battles. Moses and Joshua did, by the way. So there's a lot of discussion of that in the Old Testament. So that's why you should have always the Old Testament in mind while understanding the Islamic story too. In the story of Islam, yes, Prophet Muhammad established a state of some sort in the city of Medina, which collected taxes, had some battles, imposed a law, and that is historically been taken as the basis that Islam needs a state, it comes with a state, and it historically continued with the caliphate, came all the way to the modern world. However, why he established that is a big question, because for 13 years before that, he was just like a preacher, just like Jesus Christ in the city called Mecca. And because he began as a mere, actually the Quran calls it, you're a mere warner. You're here just to proclaim. There are verses in the Quran which says, you cannot compel people to be Muslims. You're here just to proclaim and to warn people. That was his first phase in the city of Mecca, where Muslims were a minority indeed. And there are a lot of passages from that era which shows a minority perspective, right? Now, what happened is, if they were not allowed to stay as an allowed minority there, right? They were constantly persecuted. The Prophet was almost going to be assassinated, so they had to migrate to Medina. And in Medina, there was a new environment. Their homes were plundered. The Quran gave them the permission to fight because they were persecuted. And ultimately came the last 10 years of... Again, this sounds like an Old Testament story where believers are persecuted in Egypt and they migrate to somewhere called Exodus. And there they see other tribes, land of Canaan, that they conquer, and they have some battles, and there are passages about that in the Leviticus or Book of Joshua. Actually, the Old Testament is harsher than the Quran on those battles, has been explained by many theologians or historians. Now the question is it normative to have a state defined by Islam? Or the Prophet Muhammad did it because he had to, that was the historical condition, and what comes from him to us is the religion, and religion itself doesn't include the political system. Now, this is such a question on which you have a lot of views. Hundreds of people have written on this. The people we call typically the Islamists believe din wa dawla, religion and state come together, so Islam should have its own governmental system. Which again was the norm until the modern era, and there was no liberal democracy back then, so you wouldn't expect, Christians had their Christian states as well. Change came with the Lockean shift in Christianity. I believe that what Prophet Muhammad left behind is the Quran, his normative practice of the Quran. But some of the things are just history, human history. I mean, they had to fight because they were attacked, and that doesn't give you a commandment that is applicable in all times and all places. I think Ali Abdel Razak, the famous Islamic heretical thinker in Egypt, wrote a book on this issue in 1925 when the discussion about the caliphate was around. And the book has a line which became a new book lately written by an American historian. It says Islam is a religion, not a government. It's a message, not a state. So that's one way to understand this. The other way to understand it is that Islam requires a state of its own, and that is the framework which people we call Islamists, not all of them are militant, most of them are not militant, but they somehow want to capture the state. And once you have an Islamic state, it comes with some illiberal ideas of blasphemy, apostasy, and so on and so forth. Can you have a state that is still Islamic but liberal in the modern understanding? It is possible. Don't forget that some Christian states in Europe are actually technically Christian. I mean, some liberal democracies in Europe. So there is a symbolic nature of Christianity, but you don't execute non-Christians for their heresy. And among Islamists, the Ennahda party in Tunisia was kind of gradually going towards that. Like they call them, some people call them post-Islamists. So they would say, we take political inspirations from Islam, but it's an inspiration for justice and rights for everybody. It's not about, kind of a coercive liberal state. But actually, they were not allowed to proceed in Tunisia in the past 2 years because of a, typical Arab authoritarian leader coming and crushing them with a military coup process. But I don't know if this answers your question. Yeah. Always read the Old Testament too. Just don't read the New Testament, and then read the Quran. And in many ways, the Quran is somewhere in between the two, in terms of its laws and its passages about battles and violence and war.
I do want to add one thing. So the Quran has to be sort of interpreted within the human experience of the Prophet and his companions. And so there are three contexts within the life of the Prophet that people usually look to. His experience in Mecca, where he was persecuted, his experience in Medina, where he was ruling. But then there's a third context that is often forgotten, and that is the experience of some companions who went and lived in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, under a Christian ruler as minorities. And they were tolerated, they were given religious freedom, they weren't persecuted, and they weren't ruling. And that Abyssinian context is one that some people are now talking about as, no, we have an example of what it's like to live under a just ruler where we're not ruling and we're minorities. We're not persecuted, we're not ruling. Here it is, it's right here in Abyssinia. So there is this precedent for it. And it's out of these three contexts and interpretations of the Quran that modern religious scholars have written books on what is called the fiqh of being a minority, the jurisprudence of minority living. Now, I also want to add one quick point that often most people don't know. I'm from Egypt, I was born there. In Egypt, Muslims were minorities for hundreds of years after Egypt was conquered. Egypt didn't become a majority Muslim country until the Crusades, hundreds of years after it was opened by Amr ibn al-As. So Muslims were ruling, but the majority of those ruled were not Muslim, they were Christian. And so it actually, the idea that Muslims just mass converted people by the sword is simply historically inaccurate. This was a very slow process. So Muslims living as minorities is not as, unprecedented or historically unheard of as we might think.
That's brilliant. Can I add one more thing?
Please, of course.
Thanks so much for reminding the Abyssinian experience where Muslims went there to find religious freedom and found it. And it's a founding story of Islam. Just one, to be fully clear here, there is a problem in medieval Islamic jurisprudence, and that is not all but many jurists in the medieval times thought that the Medina experience and the verses from that period abrogate the earlier period in Mecca. I mean, the story is still there, but in the Meccan period, there are verses in the Quran which says, to you your religion or to me mine. That was a message to the pagans of Mecca, because pagans were persecuting Muslims, the idolaters. To you your religion, to me mine. At the end of the Medinan period, there's a verse which says, fight them, until actually either they give up or they convert to Islam. That was just for the pagans. That was taken as more normative than the one that was in the earlier phase. That's called an abrogation, naskh in Arabic. But that was not required by the text of the Quran itself. And in the modern era, a lot of historians actually question this abrogation theory, which got rid of the most tolerant aspects of the Quran. And it's not an accident that that abrogation theory developed under a time of Islamic empires. Empires liked the more belligerent verses more than the other ones. That was more helpful to them in their context. But I think I call it highlighting the abrogated Quran, because it gives the universal principles of coexistence and non-coercion in religion, which is right there in many Meccan verses. Some early Medinan verses as well, like the one I read, there's no compulsion in religion, that's from the Medinan period, that's still from the later period. But there was a trend to abrogate or limit those verses just by taking war verses as more definitive.
Great. Karen Tumulty and Miranda Kennedy.
Well, again, I want to thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Dalia, I was interested in a couple of points that you made. You talked about how important it was that George W. Bush went to a mosque right after 9/11. I mean, the presidential leadership. But you also talked about Islamophobia being a tool of public manipulation, which of course had me thinking about Barack Obama and the degree to which the falsehood was spread that he was a quote unquote secret Muslim. And at least the polling that I was seeing back then was that this belief had taken root in, wasn't it like over half of the Republican Party? Could you talk a little bit about that and kind of the degree to which the corrosiveness of that sort of otherization narrative?
Yeah, I was going to say something yesterday about the fact that President Obama was attacked by the insult of being a Muslim, right? Where people defended him by saying, no, he's a good family man, he's not an Arab. And
yeah, he goes to that radical Christian church, but
right. And it's interesting because being called a Muslim is code. It's code. I don't think that they actually believed he was praying to Mecca 5 times a day. I just don't believe that. I think what it was shorthand and code as not of us. So Muslim was this like shorthand. And what they really were saying is he's black. But they couldn't say he's black, so they had to say, oh, he's Muslim and he was born in Kenya. And what it was it was actually white Christian nationalist rhetoric cloaked in this otherization of Barack Obama as a Muslim, because Muslim is like the shorthand, the sort of culmination of everything that is not us. And so I felt like the response of someone like Powell was like, no, he's not a Muslim, but what if he were? What would be so bad about that? And that unfortunately was never the response from the president himself. He just repeatedly said, I'm a Christian, I'm not a Muslim. It's like, yes, we all know that, including your detractors, but you're missing the point of why they're calling you that. It just underscores exactly what I'm saying, is the narrative is Muslim means not American. Other than us, everything that we are not, everything that when we learned about white Christian nationalism, everything that the vision of America is not. And so he was being rejected very much because he was black, not because they thought he was really a Muslim. That was just an excuse and a way to be able to say what they really wanted to say, what they were thinking, but do it in a way that was more acceptable.
Randa.
Thanks. Yeah. So if being Muslim is code for not being American, and you describe this like very consistent discrimination, do you think that, like, where do you see this going? Mustafa referred to Europe, where many Muslims live separate from society. That isn't the experience here. This has been going on for a long time, but do you think that there could be a kind of retreating, or do you see any of that? Or like, what is the kind of worst case endgame, I guess, and where do you think we could pull out from?
Yeah. So I never think in terms of worst case endgames. I'm like a incurable optimist, but I think that, you know, when I look at my children and young people, I don't think a retreat is really what could happen. What I see more likely is it's an alienation that isn't a retreat. It's not about being integrated or not integrated. It's being an American who's alienated. That's very American. And being a young, alienated person is about the most American thing you can be. So that's what I think will happen in the worst case scenario, is alienated young people who don't want to vote, who don't want to be involved, who don't believe in this whole project, who just all think it's a lie, and are sort of living life like that. Alienation causes all kinds of things, from violence, that's the very tiny fringe, but more likely, mental health issues and addiction and things like that. I think that's the worst case scenario, is just not feeling any sense of belonging in this mutual, in this collective project we call America. What I hope for is a recognition of how these narratives and these ideas are harming everyone. So we talked about white Christian nationalism and how it's a threat to democracy. Islamophobia is a branch of that. It's one of the key pillars of this ideology. Although I don't blame white Christian nationalists for all of Islamophobia. There's, it's a culmination of factors. But this is, Muslims are the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. This is a toxic environment that, if we don't address it, will harm all of us in terms of our democracy and our future and our sense of belonging in our own country, no matter our background.
How about we do one more from Roeda Abdelaziz from HuffPo, and then we'll take a quick break.
Dania, you mentioned, thank you both first and foremost, that the role of media in perpetuating Islamophobia, despite the different political environments that we're in, it kind of stays the same. So I was wondering if you have some thoughts as to probably the most common mistakes you see in journalism in terms of perpetuating Islamophobia, and what needs to change specifically for, as a room full of journalists, so that they are not complicit.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I tried to do that at the end. I was running out of time, but I think there are sort of like three very common mistakes. One is religion explains everything a Muslim does that's bad. The stereotypical portrayals of misogyny in Muslim communities as inherent to Muslims and only Muslims, or more prevalent in Muslim society or Muslim communities than other places, which is just empirically not true. So issues of misogyny, issues of religion explaining bad behavior, and then the third is the otherization of Muslims as not of us, not from us, foreign, other. Those are really the three major ones. And the way to correct those is to just examine them and be very critical about our own thinking. The thing about unintentional bias or implicit bias, it's not a question of if, it's a question of which one. 100% of us has an implicit bias about something. This is a part of being a human. The only way to get around that is to become aware of that. Become aware of the elephant that we're all riding. We're all riding an elephant, right? And the elephant we don't often even know exists. To become aware of our implicit bias is how we grow. It doesn't mean we're terrible people, it means we're human. Some of us have power to act on that implicit bias, some of us don't. If we do have power, then it's even more important and more incumbent upon us to become aware of those implicit bias.
Maybe there's time for one more. Can we do Christine Nemba before we got a break? Let's do Ann Snyder. She's closer. Perfect. Great. There's a complex formula. It's like how many questions and how many times the faith angle. And Ann Snyder.
Christine's question would be smarter, will be smarter. But and you just answered this a little bit, Dolly, or touched on it with this worst case endgame of the alienated younger person, and I totally agree, that's like the most American thing ever, very tragically. But it relates to liberalism, and you said, Mustafa, we're in this like John Locke moment that you think Islam globally and like emanating out of this sort of American global influences in this John Locke moment. But liberalism is in like a very funky place, obviously, and there have been many sessions of Faith Angle, I'm sure, about this the last number of years. And I'm curious, and it's in a funky place at elite intellectual levels of sort of new movements of relatively new of the last number of years that sort of have a great heyday on Twitter. I might call like a Jordan Peterson figure. I'm talking about like cultural liberalism.
Yeah.
Or of course at much more extreme levels, Andrew Tate, sort of on the one side, like far right, revivifying this like Nietzschean masculinist, frankly, like a idolatry of this like European man is what it means to be human, and kind of a desire to like beat back against the chaos that cultural liberalism has unleashed. And then you've got sort of a counter reaction in the American context on the far left. And I'm just curious if there are any trend lines you're noticing in the great diversity of younger American Muslims today. Are there any patterns you're picking up about how kind of Gen Z, younger millennials are reacting to these sort of post-liberal, even anti-liberal forces, and how that gets expressed?
So we did one survey one time where we looked at who different communities saw as allies. So that was kind of a proxy. So we asked about, like pro-life activists, people who are working on religious liberty, sort of as proxies for more conservative groups. And we also looked at people working on like Black Lives Matter, people working on environmental issues. So the most popular alliance that Muslims favored was Black Lives Matter. That was a very strong majority, more than 75%. That was sort of like the only place where there was strong agreement. Where it came to things like pro-life, religious liberty, or more of the left-leaning issues, it was like an even split. So the Muslim community in America is honestly as polarized as America is on these issues. There is no agreement in one direction or another, unlike other faith communities, actually, except for Catholics. They're as divided as Muslims, but everyone else seems to have at least some slant. Jewish Americans tend to be much more liberal. Evangelicals are much more conservative. At least there's some, quote, unity in one direction or another. Not Muslims. They are super split on these issues of like the culture war. And there's definitely a contingent of Muslims who are very drawn to the Jordan Petersons of the world because they hear in him a defense of traditional values, traditional gender roles, etc. And then there's people who can't stand him, and there's all kinds of debate within the Muslim community about these issues.
Very good question. First of all, I should say that what I advocate is decisively political liberalism. That is, I think, the major battle. And under a political liberal order, you can have all worldviews, some very traditionalist and illiberal even worldviews as well, as long as they're not coercive, because the political liberalism keeps us all, under a framework. Now, I'm still discovering the American scene, but what Dahlia says totally makes sense. A few years ago, I wrote a piece in the New York Times, "The Creeping Liberalism in American Islam." I mean, it was a pun on the idea of creeping Sharia in America, and that Muslims are bringing Sharia to Oklahoma or something. I said, what is quite the contrary? What's happening is that some cultural liberal American attitudes is creeping into the Muslim consciousness in America, and that's creating a reaction within the American Muslim community. Like, quite a few American Muslims support gay marriage, not religiously, but they say, I mean, we're not going to do it, but they do it and it's fine, it's their thing, and we, as a pluralistic society, we need that sort of toleration and so on and so forth. But there's a strong backlash against that by American Muslim clerics or some internet phenomena, the Andrew Tates of the Muslim. And by the way, I learned who Andrew Tate is a few months ago when he converted to Islam, and he has this champions of, this is what a man looks like and beats women, and that's how you do it, sort of thing. So there are guys like that. So there are those entrepreneurs in the Muslim sphere as well. But I see this as healthy. I mean, these discussions should take place. I mean, and freedom allows you to do that. You don't have the same discussion in Saudi Arabia in the first place, you can have it too. So what is happening in American Islam is now you have an incredible spectrum of very secular liberal Muslims, reformers with the rainbow flag and all that. You have very conservative people, but they at least on Twitter they kind of say something against each other, but still it doesn't go beyond that. So I think it's healthy, and I think Muslims will ultimately end up in a healthy way. Some will be more liberal, some will be more conservative, some will be more free market oriented, some will be more into a more kind of redistributive welfare state. And that is healthy. That's what a social, I mean, is there one Christian opinion in America? Obviously not. So I think that is what the Muslim scene is becoming, and there's something good in that, as long as we keep political liberalism intact, which means we won't have governments that go after groups because of their worldviews and ideologies, and we keep rule of law, freedoms intact.
Great. Perfect. Well, let's take a break. Remember, checkout from the hotel itself is 11 o'clock, so make sure you've done that if you haven't already. And let's start back here at 11 o'clock sharp, 15 minutes.
Thank you. I thought that this conversation was really fascinating. My question is actually related to our conversation from yesterday about Christian nationalism. In that conversation, there were hints of the possibility of sort of new alliances between conservative Christians or conservatives generally and Muslims around sort of gender ideology, traditional family mores. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, it does seem like if those were alliances, they would maybe be alliances of convenience. I'm not sure how long they would last, but I mean, I sometimes see this even when I'm sort of surfing in the weird corners of the extremely conservative or white nationalist internet, the sort of sentiment like, well, I'd rather live next to a Muslim family than liberals because at least they won't let you turn your kids trans or whatever. Like, there's this, maybe this ties into, Dahlia, your second point about assumptions of traditionalist misogyny, or some sort of, not quite othering, but some assumptions about a level of conservatism that is appreciated. I just don't know what to make of this phenomenon, actually. And it also, I think, ties to Andrew Tate's converting to Islam instead of Christianity, because his how he announced his conversion was something along the lines of like, I think that Islam is a stronger and fiercer, like more conservative religion than Christianity, and that was the appeal.
We need an application process. You said for conversion to Islam, I think So, yeah, I mean, you know, I think people of faith in general are not immune to starting with the outcome they want and then backtracking and finding the verses and the scripture that supports that outcome. And what I have seen is that there is this polarization in the Muslim community around these issues of, you know, the issues that people are debating, around gender and so forth, and gender and sexuality mostly, the definition of family. And so where people are finding alliances has been kind of dictated by that. And I guess I'll think about it. Let me, this is one way that I've started to think about it. One group of Muslims see their protection in the First Amendment with religious freedom and see their alliances as people working for religious freedom, which tend to be conservatives. And another group of Muslims see their protection as the Civil Rights Act and see their protection as people working within that framework of civil rights. And so the alliances are totally different. I'll also add one more piece that I don't think has been discussed, which is Muslims' racial background. Muslims are the most racially diverse faith community in America with no majority race. The plurality of Muslims are Black. About a third of Muslim Americans are Black. 14% are Arab, and about 24%, and this is other than the Arab, identify as white. And we haven't figured out why this might be, but white identifying Muslims are much more likely than all the other Muslims to gravitate to sort of finding alliances with social conservatives and Christian conservatives. Whereas Muslims that are not white are much more likely to find alliances with those working on protecting, you know, vulnerable minorities through more of a civil rights prism. And so what I see happening in the community is like the same fractures that exist in America are sort of happening, are kind of occurring in the community itself as well, with this kind of division along this question of where do Muslims really find where should they go to protect themselves? Is it in alliance with more of a civil rights prism or a religious freedom prism? The argument of the religious freedom folks is the side of the civil rights group will require you to affirm a way of life that you don't agree with. It won't accept you as you are. It won't allow you to hold views that are different from other people. They will eventually exclude you. They will eventually make you compromise if they haven't already. The other side, it's like, well, you're aligning yourself with people who are white supremacists. Like, are you sure that that's a good idea? Are you sure they're really in it to support you or protect you? These are the same people, literally the same people, who are protesting the building of a mosque. I mean, this is a real thing. 35% of mosques in America face opposition in their building or their expansion. Who's like opposing them, right? And in the name of, I mean, there's a whole script of how you oppose a mosque in America, and it's not always we hate Muslims. It's a lot of things are like, oh, zoning and ordinances, and let's have them, spend millions of dollars in legal fees. So I am not sure what the future holds, but I do see tension, and I'll be very honest on both sides. Muslims are never going to be liberal enough, I think, for a purist on the left. And they're not going to be accepted by a white, Christian nationalist kind of side, even if they might be conveniently brought in, in sort of like an alliance of convenience. What I think is really interesting, if you look at our research, we look at Muslim views of different religious communities and those communities' views of Muslims. So we asked Muslims how they regard evangelicals, and it's actually quite positive. Muslims are mostly positive about evangelicals, and evangelicals are extremely negative toward Muslims. So at one point, the side, the Muslim side is going to figure that out. I mean, they can't just think, oh, well, there's religious people who we get, we have something in common with. That's not going to last forever. At some point, they're going to get it. The one group where Muslims and the other side are equally sort of positive toward each other is actually the Jewish community. Muslims are as positive of Jews as the other way around, and it actually tends to be relatively positive. But where the biggest difference exists is white evangelicals' views of Muslims very negative, Muslims' views of evangelicals pretty positive.
Andrew Tate, any of that? No.
Sure. I fully agree with Dahlia on many points. When there was recently a court case, Supreme Court decision on Coach Kennedy, whether he can pray in the 90 yards. I'm still learning the football terms here. And why do you call it football, by the way? You play by your hand. But yeah. So, I mean, he prayed as a Christian, and could he do that in the public square? I saw the news about that, and I tweeted, I said, that's great. That's religious freedom, more religious freedom. Christians can pray, Muslims can pray, Orthodox Jews can do their thing. That's wonderful. So then I got some people reacting to me, but those are Christian conservatives who don't want to see a Muslim prayer. Then I wrote back and I said, well, if they say so, then you would ask them and you would tell them, why are you defending this as religious freedom then, right? If it's religious freedom, shouldn't we be all included in that? I would have that conversation. But then I heard some Christian conservatives who say, yeah, sure, we would welcome Muslims too, no problem with that. What we don't like is those liberals who don't want any of us to show our faith. And now, this shows, I think it's complicated. I think Muslims, as I see in America, mainstream, like practicing Muslims, on the one hand, identified with other people of faith, especially Christians, because, they value faith. But if they look at you and say, no, you are an Arab, you are a foreigner, you are a terrorist, and of course that changes everything down. Then you tend to sympathize with the liberal left, which don't care about religion that much, but values the diversity of everybody and so on and so forth. One thing that I've noticed interesting is that the left speaks to, in America, tends to speak about Muslims as an identity, as an ethnic group almost, whereas the conservatives tend to speak about it as a religion. I think it's a religion, but being a Muslim is a religious commitment. But for the left, it's people of color. It's that sort of ethnic identity. And I see this Muslims discussing within themselves, should we define ourselves as a religious community, or are we an identity group, like a group with identity? And I think these discussions will go on, and I think it's healthy that these discussions are taking place, as long as we don't derail the constitutional principles of freedom and expression and so on and so forth, and Muslims having equal rights, and they're not, targeted by their bank accounts being canceled, that kind of thing. One more thing, I think regarding the Muslim experience in the modern world, including America, I think the model, actually the most fitting model, is the Jewish experience. That is partly because Islam and Judaism are very similar religions. They're religions of the law. You have kosher laws, you have halal laws. You have, halal meat, you have kosher meat. And sometimes governments go after these practices in Europe that Muslims and Jews find themselves on the same side. I mean, there are European governments that want to ban circumcision for male children. Who gets alarmed by that? obviously Muslims and Jews because they have the exact same practice there. And in America, or for example in the UK, how do you practice Sharia, which is the Islamic version of the halakha, basically, as a minority? Well, Jews have figured it out. They, as Orthodox Jewish communities, they have a neighborhood. They have the kosher butcher and all that, and they have a communal code. They're living that as a communal practice without imposing on anybody else. There are even there's an institution called Beth Din, religious courts of arbitration that you can use for marriage. And Muslims in the UK took that as a model to have Sharia courts in the UK. When people hear about Sharia courts in the UK, oh, who's being stoned here? No, it's just about getting a marriage, divorce, or inheritance according to your religious tradition. You go there and it's an arbitration court. And Jews were doing this and Muslims actually said, why not us? So we can do the same thing. And the Jewish experience in the modern world I see goes from the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, to Jews who are just culturally Jews, but are not very practicing at all. And I think the Muslim experience is getting to that sort of diversity in America. There are Muslims who are like, yeah, I'm Muslim, my parents were Muslim, and I do eat a little bit, but I don't do much, so that's one thing. And there are people who are really very, very observant. And the observance is also is in different shades and grades. And I think more Muslims are realizing that. I think also the forces that threaten them are similar. Well, we are all Semites, and the anti-Semites, these are kind of people who think there is a great replacement by Muslims and Jews, of this racial purity that they believe in. So interestingly, there's an interesting convergence of Muslim and Jewish practices and convictions in the West, which is of course clouded by the conflict in the Middle East that puts a tension between Muslim and Jewish communities sometimes. But if you can leave that aside or solve that somehow, that's a very interesting parallelism.
I want to add to that. I think there's a lot that Muslims can learn from the Jewish experience in America. And it's not a total parallel, and there's a number of reasons why. The majority of Jews are white, and race is a very important part of the American reality. Most Muslims are people of color, they're not white. So the integration or sort of the acceptance of Muslims in mainstream America is complicated by that and makes it more difficult and makes the Jewish experience, limits it a little bit in how Muslims are, experience American life. When you look at what I talked about earlier, institutional Islamophobia, and where Muslims are dealing with it. So Muslims as a group, of which a third are Black, but broader than just Black Muslims, are as likely as Black Americans overall to have problems while banking. So there's these parallels with people of color in America around where Muslims face institutional Islamophobia that Jews don't face. So institutional, interpersonal religious discrimination, very common with Jews. When it comes to institutional religious discrimination, very different from other religious minorities. Where they are much more similar now is people of color in America. Banking while Muslim, interacting with law enforcement while Muslim, right? Things like, sometimes traveling. But the issues that face Muslims in their daily life when interacting with the state, the commonality is much more with racial minorities in America than with religious minorities.
Let's go to Adam Harris, The Atlantic.
Thank you both. Dalia, you mentioned that endorsing Islamophobic tropes isn't necessarily organic, but a tool of manipulation. And I was wondering how you think about sort of combating that in an environment where politicians see that as an effective tool to woo voters, and those same voters are effectively primed to distrust media, and sort of how you think about combating that.
The million-dollar question. it's very difficult. And the only thing that I've ever seen work, so we get political figures to be responsible, like George Bush was temporarily right after 9/11. Okay, that's not an option perhaps with certain political figures who have put, made anti-Muslim animus one of the main things in their platform. In that case, it becomes, I think, a case of two strategies. One is strengthen and engage the movable middle. So not go after the hardened, Islamophobes where Islamophobia is a part of their identity. But there's a lot of other people who are of no fault of their own, and I mean that sincerely, passively Islamophobic. And they can be engaged. They can be addressed with media. It's not like the media's, the people who distrust media and are listening to Trump, let's put them aside. There's the majority of Americans who are not. The majority of Americans are not these hardened anti-Muslim people. They can be addressed with media, and so we form a larger alliance of the willing, of the embracing, of the accurately understanding the community. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, if we are going to ever change the minds of sort of this other group, it's going to be through personal relationships. I think that's the absolutely only way. And so that's a longer term plan and a longer term strategy. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot of, like the Pew study, it's a net negative, but the plurality of Americans just have no opinion. They're not positive, they're not negative. That's great news. That's like, we can address them, we can engage them, we can reach those people. And that's one role the media really can play, a very important role.
Let's go to Phil Gorski.
So I have a comment followed by a question. So one of the most cutting edge areas in the study of American religion over the last decade or so has been looking at the complicated entanglements between race and religion, both contemporaneously and historically, and the way in which one category so often inflects the other. So, contemporaneously, the racialization of Islam is a great example. Historically, the not quite whiteness of Jews and Catholics in the early 20th century is another excellent example of this. In terms of the kind of politics of it, and it's kind of to frame the question, two observations. One is that often one way of sort of escaping a stigmatized identity is by claiming and performing a non-stigmatized identity. So kind of horrific example of this is the prominence of Irish and Italian immigrants in minstrel performance, blackface minstrel performance in the late 19th century. And another, dynamic is hostility towards the most, is a sort of hostile anti-blackness, just to cut straight to the chase. And so, I guess, you can see where I may be going with this. I'm curious about those Muslims who are claiming whiteness. Is this connected to anti-blackness? Is this connected to hostility towards black Muslims within the United States? I mean, what is within the, anything you could say would be really interesting.
So Muslims claiming to be, who identify as white, are in fact white. They're not pretending to be white. They're actually white. We have two white Muslims right here, right? We have Turks and Bosnians are actually white. That is how they're defined in the United States. So white Muslims are just honestly claiming what they actually are. Muslims from Chechnya, Muslims from Turkey, Muslims from Albania. All of these people are truly white. And so that's what they identify as. A small minority of people who claim, who identify as white Muslims are white American converts. That's actually, most of them are not. Most of them are either immigrants or children of immigrants that came to the United States. They are not more likely to have anti-Black animus as anyone else. They are more likely as a group to identify with conservative white Christians. It doesn't necessarily coincide with anti-Black racism, but they are more likely to identify with conservative white Christian sort of political and social causes. And I'll just add one other thing that supports your point. There is another phenomena that I didn't get to, which is internalized Islamophobia. So these tropes I'm talking about, Muslims sometimes endorse them themselves. And the most likely group of Muslims to endorse anti-Muslim tropes are white Muslims in our research. So there is an identification with some of these groups, and when you say performing there's all kinds of psychological research around why people internalize their own oppression or internalize the tropes about their own group. This is happening in the Muslim community, and it's among two demographic groups. One that people who identify as white Muslim it's more likely, and young Muslims are endorsing these tropes more often. And more actually since Trump came on the scene. People identified as white Muslims are also more likely to have voted for Trump, to have approved of his performance as president. So there's some unique things about this group, but one of them is not characterized as anti-Black racism. But you have these other kind of peculiar issues around, or trends within this community that we have to kind of study more. But they just tend to be more on the side closer to the kind of conservative white Christian side of things, which might make sense because I think the way America works is race is a really powerful, salient variable in the way you see the world and the way you experience the world. And so if you're otherwise, if the only thing that's really being targeted is your religious identity, I can see why you might gravitate more to a religious freedom lens and folks who are kind of fighting for that side of things. Whereas if you're targeted for a lot of different things, and Muslims have been racialized in many ways, where they're seen and sometimes talked about as a race, like anti-Muslim racism. Some scholars of Islamophobia define it that way. And so if you're experiencing life as both a racial religious minority, you might find common cause with other people of color in a different way.
Please.
As a newcomer to America, again, I should tell you one thing. Before being in the US 5 years ago, I never had the category in my mind of racial categories about defining people. I always thought of people as Muslims, Jews, Christians, and atheists, or left communists or fascists or liberals or so on and so forth. It's a very American story that there's a persecution of course, people with African American, heritage, slavery, and all the Jim Crow laws. So, it's a very important thing in this country. But when I was coming into America, I wasn't coming with that sort of feeling. And I think in Islam, at least that's something about Islam that I'm proud of. Islam historically has been colorblind. Like, it's not in the Islamic doctrine to categorize people according to their races. You categorize people according to their religion for sure. That's what it's all about. But within the religious territory, people's skin color, it was not historically definitive. I mean, Muslims had biases like any society had towards the other, but it was not in the doctrine and teaching and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, I think American Muslims might be taking a place in this American landscape where really racial identity matters a lot. On the other hand, I myself am coming from a background like I never thought about this before. I thought of as Muslims, and I would think of, oh, he's a Salafi, or he's a reformist or modernist. I never thought of something else, but now I'm thinking because it's important in this country too. Yeah. But I would caution against universalizing this particular American story. Like, the whole world isn't. I see sometimes people saying, the whole world history based on this. I don't think it's not. I mean, Muslims and Christians fought over religion for centuries. I mean, I think it was not a racial issue. Mm-hmm. Just as an observation, but I respect the complexities of this country. But from a certain perspective, it's not something that you're used to.
Yeah, that's good. All right, next up is Riyada Akil, and if it's to our opening speaker, he better watch out.
So just the nuance to your observation, to addition to what Dalia said, and then another observation/question. Again, as a historical anomaly that Bosniaks are usually seen as white, color skin-wise, Muslim people in Europe, we complicate a lot of things for a lot of people. So a lot of people want to erase us. There's not a lot of us left anyway, a couple of millions dispersed around the world. So as somebody who is not a citizen of this country, so without First Amendment and with humility personally, somebody who is always, I listen to everything and I keep learning about the complexities and accumulate the knowledge of personal stories of people around me. I carry my burdens in this country because of history, personal and that of my people, while being aware of the color of my skin, but aware of the lack of protection that it brought. My uncle who was killed, the fact that I was a war refugee, hundreds of thousands of my compatriots or fellow people, despite the color of my skin. Or the people in New Zealand who were brown, yellow, black, white, who were killed in the mosque. Always aware, I repeat, and humble about experiences of other people around me, historically as well. Which is why, now that I live as an immigrant in this country, I'm more consciously immersed in the conversations among Bosnia diaspora. And I can tell you that there are very vibrant discussions that are not always pleasant, precisely because there is a wide spectrum of Muslims within the small community, each small community, particularly I'm speaking now because, race/color of skin came as a factor. There are definitely those who would absolutely align to white supremacist ideologies, ignoring their own historical experience and that of their people, where it did not matter in the 1990s whether you're a very practicing Bosnian Muslim or Bosnian Muslim atheist, the same as it was with the Holocaust. It didn't matter. What mattered was your name and your nominal, your Muslim heritage. Everybody ended up in the same mass grave. So these people who are American citizens who align with these sort of white supremacist ideologies completely ignore that, and they're blinded/fooled. And again, there are very vibrant discussions because many younger people speak to their own fellow compatriots in diaspora, in Australia, in United States, in UK, wherever it might be, saying that no, because of that experience of genocide, we have the responsibility to be at Black Lives Matter movement, to understand what social justice means, to understand the causes, to understand what it means to carry that experience for a righteous cause in this particular context. So I just wanted to tell you firsthand experience that these are vibrant discussions that go on in this diaspora. And I think there's a lot of commotion within census in this country in terms of what white means, who self-identifies as white, because there are a lot of Turks who would not identify as white, who actually are brown, if you want to speak about shades. There are a lot of Lebanese people. There are a lot of Arabs who have to identify. There are now initiatives for bringing new category to census, to my knowledge, Middle Eastern, North African. Even conversations within that community are complicated, which means that for me, considering and knowing the Jewish experience, the Bosnian Muslim experience in terms of racialization that does not always translate into color in particular contexts, I keep remaining to be humble in this country and bring my experience that complicates some particular notions of what is expected always. So this is not, it's a conversation that's fluid and ongoing. And depending on political circumstances in particular moment, these alliances shift, fortunately or unfortunately. So that's just a little bit towards your thing and a little bit towards what Dalia was saying, because it's really not a unified thing, even within communities that happen to have this color of skin in this country or in the West, in Europe. Where we are seen as a second-class citizen, let me tell you that, not just in terms of being on the periphery or our history not being part of European books. And that is why I was very, something that we spoke yesterday at dinner and a little bit with Adam in a different context. When you were speaking about the journalist's guide, I was thinking how, I'm very curious and I'll check it out. So that is a front-end product that we hope to see as journalists and as somebody, as a practitioners that you advise. Coming from a conference just 3 days ago about journalism and objectivity, and we spoke about it a little bit at dinner. I think some of us in different contexts in this room as journalists might be very familiar with the challenges of the back-end operation, where I know with my personal experiences, those from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, many journalists of color in this context, who are so often accused of being too subjective, too close to the subject, activist, God forbid, if what it is, right? So we had a 2 days conversation about what objectivity means. Is it still a valid ideal? And I said, well, define it for me. Because so many journalists who happen to be Muslim, who happen to come from these countries, have a deep, profound knowledge, are actually hypothetically and hopefully intellectually honest, committed to journalistic ideals of truth, evidence, but are often just sidelined as, oh, no, my God, Muslim writing about Islam. We know where that's going to go and end. So I just wanted to kind of bring this conversation, considering that so many of us are journalists here, about the challenges of the back-end operation, which always leads me to the usual how important diversity is, how important these spaces are. So I'm very glad to be here, where we can have these exchanges, where editors matters and writers matter. So I know that's kind of a question, but something to just address in terms of diversity and leadership in newsrooms as well, because of the challenges in journalism. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's very little to add, really. Thank you, Riyadh. I mean, yes, it's important to have diversity in the editorial room, in the writing room, in both news and in popular media. Completely agree. And I do really recommend highly the toolkit and the guide that we developed with journalists and I think it can be really helpful and useful for coverage as you move forward.
Jamar Tisby.
Thank you both for very informative comments. Thank you both for very informative comments. One question for each of you. Dalia, you mentioned a third of Muslims in the United States identifying as African American, and I imagine that's largely due to the influence of the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm X, who you mentioned, helped to popularize. And I know in the 60s and 70s, there was some tension around whether the Nation of Islam was truly Muslim or Orthodox, however defined. And I'm wondering if any of that tension still exists today. And then relatedly, what might be some differences between people who identify themselves as Nation of Islam as compared to other Muslims? And then for Mustafa, you have this wonderful way of just talking very matter-of-factly about these incredibly dramatic events, like being arrested and spending the night in jail, and then you're like, and then I woke up the next morning and then we did this. So I'm wondering if in those situations, and even the fact that you're in the United States now, partly because it's became increasingly untenable for you to remain in your home country, what, whether it be verses or places in the Quran or stories, are you drawing from for sort of strength in those situations of genuine persecution?
Beautiful. So, you want to start?
No.
I was just going to say, I mean, the vast majority of African American Muslims are Sunni Muslims, and even within the Nation of Islam, there's been sort of a mass migration to Sunni Islam through Imam Borthdi Muhammad, who was the son of Elijah Muhammad. That sort of brought the community over to Sunni Islam. So today, that is the reality. It's in terms of differences. I would rather not venture to be an expert in something I'm not. But there were some theological differences, especially early on. Those are much softer now. Much less the case, and. Yeah, the vast majority of African American Muslims are Sunni Muslims.
Thank you so much. I mean, I should say that I don't want to exaggerate being arrested one night. People go to jail for decades, and it was a mild experience. So, and I was not tortured or anything like that. I was actually saved thanks to some, being privileged. I mean, Riyadh, my wife, called my dad in Istanbul. He called Turkey's former president, who's a good friend of my dad, not the current president, which is a different story, Abdullah Gül. And he called Sultan of Malaysia, and the Sultan's advisor called the court. So that solved things quickly. So this was like a nice treatment compared to what could have happened. But you were scared. But I was scared. I mean, the thing is, when they arrested me, they said, you violated the law which bans teaching Islam without tawliya, that is permission from the authorities. And they said the punishment is in 2 years in jail and 60,000 ringgit, so that's the currency. And the money was less issue, but 2 years in jail, so that was a bad night. Did I draw strength from my faith? Yes. First of all, I was angry at myself. Like, why did I come to Malaysia from the other end of the world just for a conference? I could have done Zoom. This was pre-Zoom, actually. And my wife had given birth to our second son just a few weeks ago. I was saying, if I were single, it's okay. It's a good thing on the career. But I have a wife and a kid, right? I was mad at myself, but yeah, I was drawn. There's this Islamic saying, "Hasbi Allahu wa ni'mal wakeel," God is the most beautiful, caretaker of you or the supporter of you. And I kept saying that. And what is funny is this, and I wrote about this actually. They put me in the jail cell, right? It was not too bad, but it's religious police has a headquarters, so they detain. They have a few rooms to detain people there. Next to the room, there was a guy who was lying like this. He was probably drugged, and that's why they had got him. So they put me there, and the morning prayer time came, and they started to recite the Quran, right? And this was the first time I heard the Quran as the voice of my oppressor, right? Like, and I felt like saying that, God, I believe in you. No, I mean, it's not there. Yeah, they read the Quran, but I'm still, it's my religion too. I mean, I felt a moment like that. They're coming after me with the Quran in their hands, but no, it's not theirs. It's my scripture too. So I had a kind of little feeling like that, and I mentioned that in a passing. Ultimately, they let me go. Again, Malaysia is a nice country to be arrested compared to Iran or Saudi Arabia or some of the other alternatives there. And the bad thing about being arrested is that you don't know what's going to happen to you, right? Especially if you're in a foreign country, you don't know the laws, you don't know whether they will really keep you there for a long time. They said you're taken to a Sharia court. I didn't know what happens exactly, when they give a verdict, what kind of verdicts they have. But yeah, I mean, you want to have hope, and you think of your family, and you pray to God to get out of this and come back to your thing. And it happened quickly, but for people, I know people who spend years in death row and for offenses like this one, besides people who go to there for real crimes maybe. I don't know if this answers your question, but thank you. Yeah, that's right.
Will Salatin.
Thank you. This touches on what some of the previous questions have asked, and I'm just going to try to pull it together. It's super clear from both your presentations what some of the messages would be to the political right? Like, don't persecute us, don't blame us all for terrorism, let us build our mosques, that kind of thing. What messages do you have for the political left in terms of misunderstanding or mistreating? You can speak for Muslims in general, for liberal or pluralist Muslims, however you'd like to put it. And it can be in this country or in Europe or elsewhere.
Talia, you know this better than me. Like everything else.
There's definitely Islamophobia on the left. So Islamophobic, the left-leaning or the Islamophobia on the left is one that accuses Muslims of being, backwards, barbaric, misogynistic, illiberal, and it's a lot more prominent in a place like France than in the United States, but it still exists here. Bill Maher is an example of that. Sam Harris is another. The new atheists, we're not their favorite people, and they tend to be somewhat, or claim to be left-leaning. So I guess what would be the response to them is a lot of things. One is, accusing Muslims of misogyny is an interesting one because it's the most prevalent anti-Muslim trope. It's actually not about violence. It's the one thing that the left and the right agree on, is that Muslim women are oppressed. And that's it. They don't agree on anything except that one point of view. So we have united the left and the right. You're welcome. The response to that is misogyny is a human problem, and Muslims are human, so yes, it does exist, but it's actually no more prominent, no more prevalent in the American Muslim community than other faith or non-faith communities by any measure you can think of, whether it's the prevalence of domestic violence or the prevalence of, really anyway, anything you can think of. And when you look at Muslim women's own experience, their biggest issue, they do face gender-based discrimination just as much as other American women. There's actually no difference in the amount, in the prevalence of it with the experience of American Muslim women. Where they are different than other American women is in their experience of racial and religious discrimination. So their problems are Islamophobia and racism, which are fed by the idea that they're oppressed, which are fed by the very idea of that they are in need of being saved. So I think that where I talk to a lot of very Islamophobic so-called feminists who claim to be feminists but are incredibly patronizing and assume so many different things about me. So I'm the last person to claim that Islamophobia is only on the right. I think it does exist on the left, and especially in this way of, and especially, I mean, in France it's so clear, but the idea that, you know, choosing hijab is you know, that it's never a choice, that's something that's inherently oppressive. I actually have a column that's coming out this week about that, about hijab and hijab bans and what the feminist position should be to oppose hijab bans with as much passion as hijab mandates. That's kind of the thesis of the article, and I'd be happy to share it with you. That's my response to the Islamophobia on the left.
Again, I'm new to this scene, but what I understand is that the voices on the right might dislike Muslims for believing in the wrong religion, and some voices in the left may dislike Muslims for believing in any religion, right? So, oh my God, you still believe in this kind of medieval nonsense sort of thing, and why don't you just be all progressive and leave this aside and take off your headscarf, or, you know, stop these kind of limitations on your life and so on and so forth. In America, that's maybe more rhetorical, but in France, certainly, which is that sort of kind of emancipating Muslims from themselves, there's this kind of belief that you should somehow make Muslim women tear their veils and bring them to the public sphere and liberate them, sort of thing. Very actually illiberal, authoritarian understanding of modernity. France is the capital of that globally, but you know, it just has boiled down to Turkey under Kemalism, in Tunisia as well, in the former Bourguiba regime. In America, God bless America, it has more religious freedom, but you know, there's sometimes kind of distaste towards religious expressions. I think it's there on the left, and on those positions, Muslims might actually find more similarity with the Christians. Yeah, I mean, the other people who believe like us, so they value religion. So there is some commonality there. And I think both right and left were very complicated in themselves, so it's hard to, but I'm just saying the troubling voices out there. Yeah.
I think the one thing is, I'll just add, is the tricky part about Islamophobia on the left is it poses as a moral position. It poses as a position that is against women's, you know, oppression. So it's tricky because it pretends to be a moral position.
We do one more question from Rueda, assuming you have one, yeah? Oh, come on. All right, oh, please, Phil Gorski, he's up. I got a question, a big one to maybe park, is like, how does the American Muslim, you know, 3 million compare to the rest of the world, the 1.8 or 1.9, in breakdown of faith? If there's any zinger on that, but Phil Gorski, how about the last question?
So circling back to the question of race and religion in American Islam, I'm curious if there is or could at some point be a kind of colorism that would emerge within the Muslim community.
Yeah, I mean, it exists. You know, again, Muslims are human before they're anything else, and so is there intra-Muslim racism? Absolutely. And that's something that people are talking about and more trying to work against, but it definitely exists. And there's colorism within Muslim communities that are the same ethnic background. You know, South Asian communities, for example, colorism exists, and then it spills out to non-South Asian people as well. But all of these things exist. It's, I would argue very strongly, against the faith of Islam and the explicit, very clear teachings of the Quran and of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But that doesn't mean that Muslims don't fall into it.
I mean, one beautiful story I always remember, and every probably Muslim in America knows this, is Malcolm X, you know, in his transition from Nation of Islam to traditional mainstream Sunni Islam. One experience is that he goes to the Hajj, the pilgrimage in Mecca. And the Hajj is this amazing experience where more than 2 million Muslims, come together every year. In the Prophet's time, it was just maybe a few thousand people, but population and travel made it a much bigger ordeal. And there he saw a community of believers beyond this us versus them, defined as in racial terms. He saw blue-eyed Muslims next to him praying to Kaaba and "Salaam alaikum, brother," "Alaikum salam, brother," and he was moved, and that was the beauty of Islam for him. And I mean, I always, believe in that sort of being this kind of people, that there's one God who created us, and we are all His creatures and His children, or His servants, how you call it from theologically different perspectives. But I think that in Islam there is that, I think, at the core, and there's some beauty in that. And so I personally believe in bringing that colorblind humanity, humaneness to all of us, while understanding that some communities come from a background that they have been systematically persecuted, excluded, so you have to specially care for that. I understand that. But also that Malcolm X's transition to Sunni Islam and the commonness he found there goes beyond racial boundaries. That's very powerful. It resonates, I think, in Muslim communities in America as well, too. That's what I can just say.
Mm-hmm. I'll just answer Josh's question, or start to answer it. How do the American Muslim community compare to the wider community of Muslims all over the world? I'd really say that American Muslims are cross-section, truly a cross-section of the rest of the Muslim Ummah, the rest of the Muslim global community, in almost every way. Most racially diverse, just as the global community is. You have every national background, every language, every ideology, every type of Muslim is here. What makes them somewhat distinct, though, there's a few things. American Muslims do tend to be, on average, more educated than Muslims in other parts of at least the West. So let me compare them to European Muslims. So one scholar of American Islam famously said that American Muslim immigrants were the children of the Cold War. So someone like my mom got a scholarship somewhat as a result of the Cold War, whereas European Muslims are children of colonialism. So the reason people immigrated to America from Muslim majority countries is very different, mostly for education, and then later on for other reasons, versus in Europe, it was cheap labor from former colonies. So it's just a very different type of demographic. And so American Muslim immigrants tend to be more educated on average than European Muslim immigrants. The other key difference among American Muslims is the large percentage of American Muslims that were either the children of converts or converted themselves. No other European context has a third or something even close of their community that are people who were either converted, their parents converted, their grandparents converted. Most of European Muslims are mostly immigrants and children of immigrants, whereas we have a third of our community that are African Americans that have ties, have a history in this country for 400 years. That is very, very uniquely American. The other uniquely American piece is that we can say, when I say something like there's never been an America without Islam, there's a very specific reason for that, because the carriers of Islam throughout American history have been Black Muslims. That is a uniquely American story. That is not the case in Europe. That just doesn't exist. So the ability for someone like me who is an immigrant to claim this indigenous belonging as a part of my faith is indebted to Black Muslims, and that is a uniquely American story. The other uniquely American piece that I think is really important is the civil rights movement, where we can call on that, on those values and on that story, on that reality, on that narrative that all Americans, for the most part, at least at some level subscribe to or aspire to or have some level of acceptance of, as being able to say we are calling on those values to get our own rights. I find it really interesting when I talk to some German Muslims or some British Muslims, French Muslims, they will actually reference our civil rights movement to talk about their rights. So it's even being borrowed, right? I mean, that's the debt that we have to Black Americans overall and Black Muslims specifically. And that's all uniquely American.
One more thing, if I may ask. One thing I've seen is, in America, compared to Europe, especially France, Belgium, there is more respect to religion. If you say, I'm doing this for religious reasons, people say, oh yeah, sure, that's wonderful. I will respect your religious tradition or something like that. I always love this. And I mean, in France, it's like, this is a thing of the past, I mean, so backward-minded and don't bring it to the public space. It's laïcité. And it's harder to integrate to the society and be fully Muslim. I think it's easier to become fully Muslim and an American because, here you are. There might be anxieties, paranoias about who you are, but, religion in itself is not a problem.
But you're not totally out of your mind because you believe in God. That's a big thing.
Thank you for an outstanding panel.
Thank you.